Arthur Penhaligon was a man who lived by logic. As a forensic accountant, his world was built on spreadsheets, cold facts, and the belief that every anomaly had an explanation. But logic failed him the day he stepped into his father's house in Blackwood Creek. His father, Dr. Silas Penhaligon, had been a renowned psychiatrist who specialized in intrusive thought disorders. 2 weeks ago, Silas had been found dead in his study. The cause of death: heart failure. The anomaly: Silas had been found sitting in a room where every single reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even a polished mahogany desk, had been covered in thick black duct tape. Arthur stood in the foyer, the air smelling of stale peppermint and old paper. He had been estranged from his father for 15 years, ever since his mother's disappearance, a case that was never solved but widely whispered to be a suicide. In the center of the living room sat a crate. It was addressed to Arthur. Inside was a device Arthur recognized from his father's early research: a mirror box. It was a simple wooden box with a mirror in the middle, typically used to treat phantom limb pain by tricking the brain into seeing a missing limb. However, this box was different. It was large enough for a person to sit inside, and the mirrors weren't flat. They were slightly angled, creating an infinite, distorted loop of reflections. Pinned to the box was a note in Silas's frantic handwriting. "Arthur, the brain does not see what is there. It sees what it expects to see. I found a blind spot, Arthur. I found a place where the mind stops lying to protect itself. Do not look into the third reflection." Arthur scoffed. To him, this was the evidence of his father's final descent into dementia. He moved to the study to begin the grim task of filing the estate papers. As he sat at the desk, he noticed a small, handheld mirror face down on the floor. It was the only reflective surface not covered in tape. He picked it up. For a split second, as he caught his own reflection, he saw someone standing directly behind him in the doorway. A woman in a yellow dress, the same dress his mother wore the night she vanished. Arthur spun around. The doorway was empty. The house was silent. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Logic," he whispered to the empty room. "Visual hallucination caused by grief and low blood sugar." But then he heard it. A faint, rhythmic scratching coming from inside the mirror box in the other room. Scratch, 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 like someone trying to find a way out of a dream. Arthur's hands shook as he pushed the study door open. The scratching had stopped. The mirror box sat in the center of the living room, a silent, wooden monolith under the dim yellow light of the chandelier. It looked harmless, yet the way the shadows clung to its edges made Arthur's skin crawl. He ignored the box and walked to his father's heavy oak cabinet. Inside, he found a row of micro-cassette tapes, each labeled with a date and a single name. He found a recorder slotted in a tape labeled Project Phantom, Session 1, Self-Observation, and press play. Silas's voice filled the room, younger, sharper, but laced with an undercurrent of dread. "The mirror box is traditionally a tool of healing," the recording began. "By reflecting the healthy limb, we convince the brain the missing one is whole. But what if we reflect the mind? If I angle the mirrors at exactly 42 degrees, I create a visual feedback loop. The subject sees themselves, then a reflection of that reflection, and so on. By the third reflection, the brain can no longer process the latency. It begins to fill in the gaps with subconscious data. It doesn't show you what you look like. It shows you what you're hiding." Arthur paused the tape. "Nonsense," he muttered. He looked at the box. It was a challenge. If he was to prove his father was merely a broken old man, he had to face the trap himself. He climbed into the box. The interior was lined with high-quality glass. Because of the slight angles, Arthur saw an infinite line of himself stretching into a dark, silver distance. He looked at the first reflection, himself. Tired, grieving, cynical. He looked at the second reflection, the room, the distorted edges of his father's house. Then, he forced himself to look at the third reflection. In the third pane of glass, Arthur wasn't alone. He saw his own reflection sitting in the box, but behind the reflected Arthur, the woman in the yellow dress was sitting on the floor. Her back was to him. She was brushing her hair, but she had no arms. The brush moved in the air, guided by an invisible force. Arthur froze. In the real world, he felt a sudden, icy draft on the back of his neck. He didn't turn around. He knew the doorway was empty in reality. But in the mirror, the woman stopped brushing. She slowly began to turn her head. Her neck twisted at an impossible angle, 180 degrees, until her face was looking directly at the reflected Arthur. It wasn't his mother's face. It was a face with no features, just smooth, pale skin where eyes and a mouth should be. The reflected Arthur in the third mirror didn't look scared. Instead, the reflection leaned forward and whispered something. Arthur couldn't hear it, but he saw his own lips move in the glass. Arthur scrambled out of the box, knocking it over. He sat on the floor, gasping for air. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He realized with horror that on his left wrist, there was a faint red mark, a bruise in the shape of a small, fingerless hand. He hadn't had that mark when he entered the box. The tape on the recorder hissed, and Silas's voice returned for one final sentence. Warning, the reflections do not stay in the glass. They are looking for a body that hasn't realized it's already hollow. Arthur didn't pack. He didn't even grab his coat. He simply grabbed his car keys and bolted for the front door. The air outside was bitingly cold, the sky a bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the jagged pines of Blackwood Creek. He jumped into his sedan and slammed the locks. "It's just stress," he hissed, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Grief-induced psychosis. I'll drive to a motel, call a doctor in the morning, and sell this godforsaken house by noon." He threw the car into reverse. As he looked into the rear-view mirror, he slammed on the brakes. The driveway behind him was gone. In the mirror, the car wasn't parked in front of his father's Victorian house. It was parked in the middle of a vast, charred forest. The trees were black skeletons, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of gray ash. Arthur blinked and looked over his shoulder, out the actual back window. The driveway was there. The house was there. Everything was normal. He looked back at the mirror. The charred forest remained. He shifted into drive and floored it. He watched the side mirrors as he sped down the winding mountain road. The reflections showed the world as a distorted, hellish version of reality. In the mirrors, the road was made of cracked bone, and the signs were written in a language that looked like tangled hair. Then he saw it. In the side mirror, a figure was sprinting behind the car. It was the woman in the yellow dress. She was running with a jagged, unnatural gait, her feet hitting the pavement with the sound of snapping wood. She was gaining on him. Arthur looked at his speedometer, 70 miles per hour. In the mirror, she was only a few feet from the bumper. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. The steering wheel locked. Arthur fought it, but the car veered off the road, sliding into a ditch. The headlights flickered and went out. Silence descended. Arthur sat in the dark, his breath fogging the windshield. He slowly reached up and tilted the rearview mirror away from his face. He didn't want to see, but as he moved the mirror, he saw a glint of light from the glove box. He opened it. Inside wasn't his registration. It was a Polaroid photograph and a small, silver tuning fork. The photo was of his father and mother, but his father had been scratched out with a needle, leaving only a jagged hole in the paper. His mother was smiling, holding a small wooden box, a miniature version of the mirror box. On the back, his father had written, "The mind is a cage. The reflection is the key. You cannot drive away from what is already inside the car with you, Arthur." A soft tap, tap, tap sounded against the driver's side window. Arthur turned his head slowly. There was no one outside, but on the glass of the window, a frost was forming. Within the frost, the words were appearing, written from the outside in reverse. "Help me finish the count." Arthur realized he couldn't leave. The mirrors weren't showing him another world. They were showing him the world he was currently trapped in. To get back to reality, he had to go back to the source. He had to go back to the box. The walk back to the house felt like a journey through a fever dream. Every time Arthur glanced at his watch, the hands were spinning counterclockwise. The gravel path beneath his feet felt like soft, wet velvet, and the trees seemed to lean toward him, whispering in a voice that sounded like static. He burst through the front door of the house, gasping for air. The mirror box was no longer where he had left it. It had moved to the center of the hallway, its door wide open, inviting him back into the silver trap. "I'm not going back in," Arthur shouted at the empty house. "You're not real." He grabbed a heavy fire iron from the hearth, intending to smash the mirrors to pieces. But as he swung at the box, he stopped. Taped to the inside of the box, visible only from a specific angle in the second reflection, was a small, leather-bound book. His mother's diary. Arthur dropped the iron and reached into the box. The air inside was impossibly cold, smelling of ozone and dead lilies. He pulled the diary out. The pages were damp, as if they had been submerged in water for years. He opened it to the final entry, dated the night she disappeared. "Silas thinks he is curing me. He says my phantom grief is just a misfiring of the parietal lobe. He put me in the box today for the 3rd hour. He told me to look past the 3rd reflection. I did. I saw the woman I could have been if I hadn't married him. She was beautiful. She was free. But then she reached out and touched my glass. She didn't want to come out. She wanted me to go in. Arthur, if you find this, know that your father didn't kill me. He just stopped looking for me in the right room." Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He realized his father hadn't been a murderer. He had been a collector. He was trying to find the perfect version of his family by sifting through the reflections. Suddenly, the tuning fork in Arthur's pocket began to vibrate. It grew so hot it burned through the fabric. He pulled it out, and the moment it touched the air, it let out a high-pitched, crystalline ring. The mirrors in the box reacted. They didn't break, they rippled. The surface of the glass became liquid. From the liquid silver, a hand emerged. It was a human hand, but the skin was translucent, showing the white bone beneath. It gripped the edge of the wooden box, pulling a figure upward. It was his mother, but she was incomplete. Her left side was perfectly human, but her right side was made of jagged mirror shards that reflected the room in 1,000 different angles. She looked at Arthur with her one human eye, and the reflection of that eye in her own skin wept a single silver tear. "Arthur," she whispered. The sound didn't come from her mouth. It came from the mirrors all around the room. "The count. We have to finish the count." "What count?" Arthur backed away, tripping over his father's medical bag. "The reflections," she said, her voice splintering. "Silas found the 3rd. He died trying to reach the 4th. But there are 7, Arthur. 7 layers of the soul. If we reach the 7th, we could go back to the beginning. Before the box. Before the silence." Outside, the house began to groan. The black duct tape on the windows started to peel away, revealing the charred forest from the car, mirror pressing against the glass. The house didn't just groan, it began to collapse inward. The corners of the ceiling curled like burning paper, and the floor tilted at an impossible angle. Arthur watched in horror as the walls of the hallway stretched, the hallway becoming a miles-long tunnel of distorted wood and peeling wallpaper. "Arthur, take my hand," his mother cried. Her voice sounded like a chorus of glass bells. Arthur looked at the mirror box. It was the only stable thing in the room. He realized the box wasn't just a tool. It was the anchor for this collapsing reality. If he didn't get inside, he would be crushed by the folding geometry of the house. He grabbed his mother's human hand. It felt cold like marble. Together, they stepped into the silver liquid of the box. The world vanished. There was no up or down. Arthur felt himself falling through a kaleidoscope of his own life. He saw himself at 5 years old, at 10, at his graduation, but in every scene his father was in the background, holding a mirror, watching. "Don't look at the past," his mother warned. "Look at the 4th reflection." Arthur forced his eyes away from the memories. In the infinite loop of mirrors, he saw the 1st reflection, himself, the 2nd, the room, and the 3rd, the featureless woman. But now, a 4th pane of glass appeared. It was pitch black. As they drifted toward it, the blackness began to resolve into a shape. It was a small, windowless room. A nursery. Arthur recognized the wallpaper, blue with white clouds. "This was your room," his mother whispered. In the reflection, a young Silas was standing over a crib. He wasn't crying. He was reciting numbers. 1, 2, 3. Arthur watched his father reach into the crib and pull out a small glass-like orb. Inside the orb, A tiny infant was sleeping. It wasn't a baby. It was a data point. He didn't just divide me, Arthur, his mother said, her mirror shard side glowing with a pale light. He divided you. The Arthur Penhaligon who lives by logic, the forensic accountant who hates the ocean and loves spreadsheets. That's just the version he kept. The rest of you, the dreamer, the artist, the boy who loved the dark, he locked away in the fourth reflection. Arthur felt a surge of cold fury. His entire personality, his very logic, was a curated cage. Suddenly, the reflected Silas in the fourth mirror turned around. He looked through the glass, straight at Arthur. "You're late for the audit, Arthur," the reflection of his father said. He held up a hand mirror. "The fourth reflection is the weight. You cannot go to the fifth until you accept the parts of yourself I cut away." The glass baby in the crib began to scream. It wasn't a human cry. It was a high-frequency vibration that began to shatter the mirrors around them. "The count," his mother shouted over the noise. He stopped at 3. "We have to say the number." Arthur looked at the screaming, glass child in the mirror. He reached out and touched the fourth reflection. 4, he whispered. The nursery exploded into a million shards of blue cloud wallpaper. The explosion of the nursery didn't lead to light. It led to nothing. Arthur felt his feet hit a floor that felt like cold, damp sand. He reached out, but his mother's hand was gone. He tried to open his eyes, but there was no difference between blinking and staring. The darkness was absolute, thick like ink. This was the fifth reflection, the void of the senses. "Mother," he called out, but his voice didn't echo. The sound was swallowed instantly, as if the air itself was made of velvet. Then the sound began. Not voices, but the frantic, rhythmic clicking of 1,000 typewriters. As Arthur moved forward, his hands brushed against something paper-thin and vertical. He followed the surface. It was a wall, but not made of brick or wood. It was made of patient files. Thousands of manila folders were stacked from the floor to an invisible ceiling, forming a suffocating, narrow labyrinth. He pulled a file at random. He couldn't see the text, but as his fingers touched the paper, the information bled into his mind like an electric shock. Subject: Patient 402. Diagnosis: Chronic nostalgia. Treatment: Mirror reflection cauterization. Arthur realized with a jolt of horror, these weren't just files. These were the parts his father had removed from hundreds of people. The labyrinth was a graveyard of discarded personalities. "Arthur," a voice whispered. It wasn't his mother. It was his own voice, but younger, sounding full of wonder and joy. He followed the sound, stumbling through the paper maze. He felt the walls pulsing with the heartbeat of the stories they held. He heard the sound of a piano he used to play, the smell of a rain-drenched forest he once loved, the feeling of a first crush he had forgotten. He reached a small clearing in the labyrinth. In the center, a single, dim candle flickered. Sitting by the candle was a boy, about 7 years old. The boy was drawing in the dirt with a stick. "Who are you?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling. The boy looked up. He had Arthur's eyes, but they were bright, not tired. "I'm the part that likes the shadows," the boy said. "Father," said the shadows, "make the spreadsheets hard to read. So he put me here." The boy held up a small hand mirror. "The fifth reflection is the sensory deprivation, Arthur. Father thought that if he took away the world, we would finally be pure. But without the world, we are just ghosts in a filing cabinet." Suddenly, the paper walls began to rustle. The typewriter sound grew deafening. From the shadows of the files, tall, paper-thin figures began to emerge. They were the auditors, entities made of redacted documents and black ink. They didn't have faces, only the word incomplete stamped where their hearts should be. "They're coming to file us away," the boy said, standing up. "We have to finish the count." "Say it, Arthur." "Say the number of the senses." The auditors closed in, their paper hands reaching out to shred Arthur's reality. Arthur grabbed the boy's hand, feeling a piece of his soul click back into place. 5, Arthur bellowed. The candle flared into a pillar of white fire, burning the paper labyrinth into white ash. The white fire of the burnt files didn't fade. It solidified into white marble. Arthur found himself standing in a vast, circular courtroom that stretched upward into a dome of frosted glass. In the center of the room stood a high bench, and behind it sat Dr. Silas Penhaligon. He looked exactly as he did the day he died. Stiff suit, polished shoes, and eyes that held the cold clarity of a microscope. But he wasn't alone. The jury box was filled with dozens of Arthurs. There was the logical Arthur in his forensic suit, the grieving Arthur in funeral black, and even a terrified Arthur who hid his face in his hands. Every version of himself that had ever existed was there, watching him with varying degrees of contempt and pity. "The audit is now in session," Silas said, his voice echoing like a gavel. Subject: Arthur Penhaligon. Charge: inconsistency. You have allowed the shadows to return. You have broken the seal of the fourth and fifth reflections. You are making the specimen unclean. I am not a specimen, Father, Arthur shouted, his voice cracking. He felt the 7-year-old boy's hand tightening in his own. "Everything is a specimen under the right light," Silas countered. He leaned forward. "I gave you a gift, Arthur. I removed the chaos. I gave you a mind that could find the truth in the numbers. I protected you from the yellow dress, from the madness that took your mother. Why would you want to be whole when wholeness is just another word for suffering?" The logical Arthur in the jury box stood up. "He's right," the reflection said. "Without the box, we feel everything. The pain is too much. Logic is safer. Let the auditor redact us. Let us go back to the spreadsheets." Arthur looked at the jury of himself. He saw the safety they craved, but he also saw the hollowness. They weren't living. They were just calculating time until death. "The sixth reflection is judgment," the young boy whispered. "But you aren't the one on trial, Arthur." "He is." Arthur looked back at his father. He noticed something. In the reflection of the marble floor, Silas had no shadow. He wasn't a person. He was just a memory of an ego, a ghost created by Arthur's own repressed fear. "I'm not here to be judged by you," Arthur said, stepping toward the bench. "I'm here to close the case. You didn't protect me from Mom's madness. You were the one who drove her into the glass. You were so afraid of a world you couldn't control that you tried to turn your family into a mirror box." Silas's face began to crack, literally. Thin, silver lines appeared on his forehead. "I was the architect. I was the one who found the blind spot." "You didn't find a blind spot," Arthur said, reaching the bench. "You created one." Arthur picked up the heavy, brass gavel from a bench. He didn't hit Silas with it. Instead, he struck the marble floor beneath his own feet. "Six!" Arthur roared. The marble floor shattered like a frozen lake. The courtroom, the jury of Arthurs, and the crumbling image of Silas plummeted into a void of rushing wind and silver light. Arthur didn't fall into darkness. He fell into the smell of cinnamon and floor wax. When he opened his eyes, the rushing wind had been replaced by the soft hum of a refrigerator. He was standing in his childhood kitchen. The sun was streaming through the window, casting long, golden rectangles across the linoleum floor. It was a Saturday afternoon, 15 years ago. "Arthur, honey, could you hand me those plates?" Arthur spun around. His mother was there. She wasn't made of shards or translucent bone. She was whole, wearing her favorite yellow dress, her hair caught in a simple braid. She looked vibrant, alive, and completely sane. "Mom!" Arthur's voice broke. He looked at his hands. They were no longer clawed or bruised. He was young again, his skin smooth, the weight of the last 2 weeks gone. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's just lunch. Your father will be home from the clinic in 20 minutes. Arthur walked toward her, his heart aching with a joy so sharp it felt like a wound. He could stay here. This was the seventh reflection. It wasn't a trap. It was a sanctuary. The logic of the mirror box dictated that the seventh layer was the original image, the moment before the mind began to fracture. He sat at the table, and for a moment, he let himself believe it. He ate the food, he listened to her hum a tune, and he felt the warmth of the sun on his neck. It was perfect, but then he looked at the kitchen window. In the reflection of the glass, he saw the truth. Outside the window, there was no Blackwood Creek. There was only a vast, shimmering silver grid. The sunlight was just the glow of the mirror box's internal lamps. He looked at his mother. In the window's reflection, she was still the shattered woman, her right side made of jagged glass. She was smiling at him, but in the reflection, she was weeping. "It's not real, is it?" Arthur whispered. His mother stopped humming. She sat down across from him and took his hands. "It is as real as you want it to be, Arthur. This is the only place where we are happy. If you stay, the count stops. The mirrors stay sealed. You never have to feel the pain of my death or your father's madness ever again." Arthur looked at the front door. He knew that if he walked out that door, he would be back in the real house. He would be an orphan. He would be a man with a broken car in a ditch, facing an estate of debt and a legacy of trauma. "What happens if I finish the count?" Arthur asked. "The box dies," she said softly. "The reflections return to the world. You will be whole, Arthur, but you will be alone. And you will remember everything. Every scratch on glass. Every scream in the dark." Arthur looked at the kitchen clock. It was stuck at 12:59. It would always be 12:59 here. "My father spent his life trying to live in a perfect reflection," Arthur said, tears blurring his vision. "He died in a room covered in tape because he couldn't stand the sight of the real world. If I stay here, I'm just his final successful experiment." He stood up and picked up a glass of water from the table. He looked at his mother one last time. "I love you, Mom, but you're a memory, and I need to be a man." He smashed the glass against the kitchen floor. "7," he whispered. The kitchen didn't just disappear, it delaminated. The yellow wallpaper peeled away to reveal the pulsing silver light of the void, and the smell of cinnamon was replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of ozone. Arthur felt a violent, wrenching sensation in his chest, as if his soul was being pulled through a needle's eye. He hit the floor of his father's study with a bone-jarring thud. The house was dark, but it wasn't silent. The black duct tape that had covered the windows and mirrors was shredding itself, fluttering to the floor like the wings of dead moths. But the world Arthur returned to was no longer real. The mirror box had leaked. By reaching the 7th reflection and then shattering it, Arthur had broken the seal between the subconscious and the physical. The house was now a physical audit. Arthur stood up, his joints aching. He looked into the hallway and froze. The house was crowded. There were dozens of figures, the redacted patients from the 5th reflection. They weren't ghosts. They were physical husks, gray and featureless, wandering the halls. They were searching for the parts of themselves Silas had stolen. They were searching for a reflecting surface. Arthur, a wet, sliding sound came from the corner of the study. It was the logical Arthur, the version of himself he had seen in the jury box. This version was cold, its skin the color of ash, its eyes replaced by glowing calculator screens. It crawled toward him, its fingers making a sound like clicking keys. "We need to balance the books," the logical Arthur hissed. The error must be corrected. Arthur realized with a surge of panic that he was being hunted by his own repressed fragments. If they touched him, they would merge with him, turning him back into the hollow, unfeeling man his father had designed. He sprinted out of the study, dodging a group of gray patients who were clawing at a window, trying to see their own non-existent faces in the glass. He needed to get to the living room. He needed to find the master box, the one his father had sent him. It was the source. Every other reflection in the house was powered by the geometry of that one wooden crate. As he reached the living room, he saw it. The mirror box was pulsing with a rhythmic violet light. It was no longer a box. It had grown, its wooden panels stretching into a tall, jagged pillar of mirrors that reached the ceiling. Sitting at the base of the pillar was his father, Silas. Not the judge from the courtroom, but the real Silas, or what was left of him. It was a withered, mummified corpse, fused to the box by wires and silver thread. Silas's dead eyes were wide open, staring into the infinite reflections he had created. "Finish it." The corpse's jaw clicked, a final remnant of a recorded voice. "The loop must close." Arthur grabbed the fire iron he had dropped earlier, but as he approached the box, the mirrors shifted. Instead of showing his reflection, the box showed him a vision of his future. He saw himself 20 years from now, sitting in this same chair, covered in tape, obsessed with the same silver madness. No, Artur Guisperth. That's the logic. That's the calculation. But I'm the one who knows how to break the count. The logical Arthur burst into the room, lunging for his throat. At the same time, the gray patience began to pour through the walls, a sea of incomplete souls looking for a home. Arthur didn't swing the iron at the creatures. He didn't swing it at his father. He swung it at the tuning fork he had dropped on the floor, the one that had guided him through the layers. The fire iron struck the silver tuning fork with the force of a thunderclap. The sound that followed wasn't a note. It was a scream of physics. The vibration didn't travel through the air. It traveled through the glass. Arthur watched in slow motion as a spiderweb of cracks erupted from the center of the master box. The violet light bleeding from the mirrors turned a blinding, prismatic white. The frequency hit the logical Arthur first, the calculator-eyed doppelganger shattering into a cloud of gray dust. The redacted patients wandering the halls began to dissolve, their paper-thin bodies turning into harmless steam as the reflections that gave them form were revoked. The count, Arthur gasped, his lungs burning. 0. With a final deafening crack, every mirror in the Penhaligon estate exploded simultaneously. The force of the blast threw Arthur against the wall. He felt shards of glass grazing his skin, but they didn't cut. They felt like cold rain. For a moment, the house was filled with a swirling cyclone of silver dust, the remnants of every memory, every trauma, and every stolen soul Silas had ever bottled. Then silence. Total, crushing silence. Arthur lay on the floor, breathing heavily. The house was a wreck. The black duct tape was gone, but so was the glass. Every window was an empty frame. Every mirror was a hollow wooden back. Even the polished surfaces of the furniture had been dulled to a matte finish. The master box was now just a pile of splintered cedar. Arthur sat up and looked at the armchair. His father's body was gone. There was only a pile of old, yellowed patient files and a single, heavy Victorian key. He walked to the front door and stepped outside. The charred forest was gone. The reflected world was gone. The sun was rising over the actual Blackwood Creek, the morning mist clinging to the pines. It was a cold, gray, ordinary morning. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the Polaroid of his mother. It was no longer scratched out. Silas was there, smiling, looking like a man who was deeply in love and tragically afraid of losing it. His mother was there, too, her eyes clear and full of a secret she would never have to tell. He realized the truth now. Wholeness wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about logic or shadows. It was about the ability to look at a broken mirror and still recognize your own face. He walked to his car in the ditch. It didn't look like a hellish bow machine anymore. It was just a stalled sedan. He sat in the driver's seat and looked into the rearview mirror. The glass was gone. All he saw was the empty plastic frame and the road ahead, reflected in the dusty metal of the dashboard. Arthur Penhaligon, the man who lived by logic, started the engine. It roared to life. He didn't look back. He didn't need a mirror to know who was following him anymore. He carried his mother's laugh, his father's grief, and his own rediscovered childhood in his heart, not in a box. As he drove away from Blackwood Creek, he passed a small pond. For a split second, he saw his reflection in the water. He looked tired. He looked older. He looked like a man who had survived a war with himself. He smiled, and for the first time in 15 years, the man in the water smiled back.